History is a ghost story, haunted not by the dead, but by the tales we tell of them. And of all the spectres that wander the gilded halls of European memory, none is more maligned, more grotesquely caricatured, than that of the woman they called Catherine the Great. The Whispers paint her as a creature of insatiable appetites, a nymphomaniac empress whose boudoir was a revolving door for a regiment of lovers. The most venomous of these tales, a masterpiece of political slander, follows her even to her deathbed, concocting a sordid fantasy involving a stallion and a broken harness. This is the dark legend, the pornographic fiction designed to eclipse a legacy so brilliant it terrified the men who wrote its first draft. But to find the truth, we must silence the ghoulish whispers and travel back to a world before the monster was invented, to find the girl who was never meant to rule. Our story begins not in the glittering, ice-bound heart of the Russian Empire, but in the damp, provincial greyness of Stettin, Prussia. Here, on the 2nd of May in 1729, a girl was born into the world with a name as long and unpromising as her family's prospects. Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt, Zerbst, Dornberg. She was the daughter of a minor German prince, a man whose title was grander than his lands, and whose coffers were perpetually shallow. In the rigid, patriarchal chessboard of 18th-century European nobility, Sophie was a pawn of little value. Her world was one of needlepoint, modest balls, and the prescribed education for a girl of her station: French, music, Lutheran catechism, and the delicate art of being agreeable. But within this unremarkable princess, a fire was kindled. Sophie was possessed of a formidable intellect and a restless, hungry ambition that could not be satisfied by the dreary provincial court. While other girls practiced their minuets, Sophie devoured books. She read Plutarch, Montesquieu, and the radical new philosophers of the Enlightenment. She learned not just how to dance, but how to observe the intricate dance of power, even on her father's small stage. She looked out at the slate-grey Baltic Sea and dreamed not of a handsome prince, but of a grand destiny, a world vast and significant enough to contain the force of her will. She was a mind forged for an empire, trapped in the life of a footnote. Then, in 1744, destiny answered. A letter arrived, bearing the imperial seal of Russia. The Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, a woman of formidable power and appetites of her own, was seeking a bride for her nephew and heir, the Grand Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. The requirements were specific: a German princess of good health, impeccable lineage, and, crucially, one who was Protestant and thus malleable, ready to be reshaped by the Orthodox faith. From a list of candidates, the 15-year-old Sophie was chosen. It was a golden lottery ticket, a miraculous escape from provincial obscurity to the very center of immense power. For her family, it was a triumph. For Sophie, it was the opening move in a game she was born to play. Her journey to Russia was a brutal baptism. The long, bone-jarring trek across the frozen plains of Eastern Europe was a physical and psychic passage from one world to another. She left behind the familiar grey skies of Prussia for an endless expanse of white, a landscape of savage beauty and unforgiving cold. When she finally arrived in Moscow, she was plunged into a court of such Byzantine complexity and opulent splendor that it made the German palaces of her youth look like dollhouses. It was a world of breathtaking contradictions, of profound piety and savage cruelty, of exquisite French manners and barbaric punishments, of shimmering silk and the ever-present threat of steel. The air in the Winter Palace was thick with the scent of beeswax, incense, and intrigue. Every courtier wore a mask of deference, but behind their eyes, she saw the glint of calculation. This was a place where a misspoken word could lead to exile in Siberia, and a well-placed compliment could secure a fortune. Sophie knew she was not just a guest, she was an audition. With a ferocious determination that stunned the jaded Russian court, she set about erasing the German girl and forging a new identity. While her intended, Grand Duke Peter, openly clung to his Prussian heritage, Sophie declared her heart to be wholly Russian. She threw herself into her studies, often rising in the dead of night, pacing her cold bedchamber barefoot while repeating Russian vocabulary until her feet were numb and the words were etched into her mind. She contracted a severe pleurisy from her efforts, bringing her close to death. When the doctors suggested a Lutheran pastor be summoned, she refused, demanding an Orthodox priest instead. It was a masterstroke of public relations. News of the German princess's devotion spread through the court and into the city, impressing the empress and endearing her to her future subjects. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy in a lavish public ceremony, shedding her old name like a snakeskin. Sophie Friederike Auguste was no more. In her place stood Ekaterina Alexeyevna, the Grand Duchess Catherine. On the 21st of August, 1745, at the tender age of 16, she was married to Peter. The wedding was a magnificent affair, a spectacle of imperial wealth and power. But as the celebrations faded, Catherine found herself trapped in a waking nightmare. The marriage, the very foundation of her new life, was a hollow sham. Peter was a disaster, not a tragic, romantic figure, but a pathetic and cruel one. He was a stunted man-child, emotionally arrested and intellectually vapid. While Catherine read Voltaire, Peter played with his toy soldiers, arranging them in elaborate battle formations and conducting mock court-martials of rats he caught in their chambers. He was a drunkard, his face often puffy and flushed with wine, his conversation puerile and insulting. He made no secret of his contempt for Russia, the country he was destined to rule, and his fanatical adoration for its nemesis, Prussia, and its king, Frederick the Great. Worst of all, he showed no interest in Catherine as a wife or a woman. The imperial bed remained cold. The marriage, for years, was unconsummated. The pressure on Catherine was immense. Her sole purpose in Russia was to produce an heir, to secure the Romanov dynasty. Without a child, her position was precarious, subject to the whims of the aging Empress Elizabeth. She was a Grand Duchess in name, but a prisoner in reality, isolated in a hostile court, married to a fool who ignored her and watched constantly by the Empress's spies. It was in this gilded cage, in the long, lonely years of her sham marriage, that the first seeds of the myths were sown. Starved of affection and intellectual companionship, she sought it elsewhere. Her intelligence, wit, and natural charm became her weapons for survival, attracting a circle of admirers and allies among the disillusioned court nobility. These were not illicit trysts, but alliances, friendships forged in the crucible of a shared predicament. Yet in the whispering galleries of the palace, every conversation was a conspiracy, every friendship a dalliance. The foundation for the caricature of the promiscuous empress was being laid, brick by malicious brick, long before she ever held a scepter. For now, she was merely surviving, learning, and waiting for the old empress to die, and for the calamitous reign of her husband to begin.
The great gilded clock of the Russian Empire stopped on Christmas Day, 1761. Empress Elizabeth, that force of nature who had plucked Catherine from obscurity, was dead. A hush fell over the winter palace, a silence filled not with grief, but with a collective, held breath of terror. For Catherine, the moment was a precipice. The woman who had been her patron, her protector, and her jailer was gone. Now, standing between her and utter ruin was only her husband, the feckless Grand Duke Peter, who at last ascended the throne as Emperor Peter III. His reign, one of the shortest and most catastrophic in Russian history, would not be a chapter but a frantic scribbled footnote that would change the course of a continent. It lasted a mere 6 months. From the very first day, Peter proved to be not just an incompetent ruler, but a willing saboteur of his own empire. His obsession with his native Prussia, once a private eccentricity, now became disastrous state policy. Russia had been fighting Prussia in the bloody 7 Years' War and was on the verge of a decisive victory. Russian troops occupied Berlin. In an act of stunning political suicide, Peter not only declared an immediate peace, but returned all conquered territories to his idol, Frederick the Great, without demanding a single concession. He switched sides, allying Russia with its battered enemy and preparing to send Russian troops to fight against their recent allies. The army was aghast. The officer corps who had bled for years on Prussian soil watched in disgust as their emperor betrayed their victories. His insults were not confined to the battlefield. He held the Russian Orthodox Church, the spiritual bedrock of the empire, in open contempt. He mocked its ancient rituals, flouted its fasts, and began making plans to seize church lands and force priests to shave their beards and dress like Lutheran pastors. He alienated the nobility, surrounding himself with his boorish German companions from Holstein, promoting them to high office while openly ridiculing the proud aristocrats of the Russian court. The final fatal insult was to the heart of the army's pride, the Imperial Guards. These elite regiments, the kingmakers of Russia, were ordered to abandon their revered green uniforms for the stark blue ones of the Prussian army. It was a humiliation they would not forgive. Peter was not just remodeling an empire, he was taking a sledgehammer to its foundations, and the entire structure began to groan. For Catherine, this period was of mortal peril. As Peter's popularity plummeted, his paranoia and cruelty towards her grew. He flaunted his mistress, Elizabeta Worontsova, a coarse and unattractive woman he called his Romanova. He spoke openly of divorcing Catherine, of repudiating their son Paul as illegitimate, and of locking her away in a convent for the rest of her life. The whispers of her supposed infidelities, once palace gossip, were now his public excuse to destroy her. Catherine knew her time was running out. She was no longer just an unhappy wife, she was an obstacle to the emperor, and obstacles in the Russian court were brutally removed. But she was not idle. The alliances she had so carefully cultivated during her long years of isolation now became the scaffolding for a conspiracy. Chief among her supporters were the 5 Orlov brothers, handsome, ambitious, and fiercely patriotic officers in the Imperial Guard. The most charismatic of them, Grigory Orlov, was not only Catherine's steadfast political ally, but also her lover. Theirs was a relationship forged in shared danger and ambition, a passionate union that was also a pact to save themselves and Russia from the madman on the throne. Working with other disillusioned nobles and officers, they began to plot. They were not merely planning a palace coup, they were orchestrating a national rescue mission, and Catherine was to be its symbol and its commander. The plot was dangerously accelerated in late June of 1762. One of the conspirators was arrested, and under interrogation, the entire plan threatened to unravel. Peter was away at his summer palace, Oranienbaum, preparing to launch his absurd war against Denmark. The conspirators knew that if he returned to St. Petersburg, they would all be arrested and executed. The moment for hesitation was over. It was time to strike. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 28th, Alexei Orlov galloped to the Peterhof Palace where Catherine was staying. He woke her with 2 urgent words: "It is time." There was no turning back. Showing the courage that would define her reign, Catherine dressed quickly and slipped out of the palace. In a waiting carriage, she raced through the morning mist towards St. Petersburg and the barracks of the Izmailovsky Guard. As the sun began to rise, she stood before the half-dressed, astonished soldiers, her hair down, her face pale but resolute. Grigory Orlov made a passionate appeal, declaring the emperor a traitor and presenting Catherine as their only true sovereign. A cheer erupted, the soldiers, seeing in her the embodiment of Mother Russia betrayed by a foreign fool, swore allegiance on the spot. It was the first domino to fall. News spread like wildfire. Accompanied by the Izmailovsky regiment, Catherine proceeded to the barracks of the other guards. Regiment after regiment poured out to join her, their hated Prussian uniforms hastily torn off. A tidal wave of military support, with Catherine at its crest, swept into the city. The populace, hearing the commotion, streamed into the streets cheering for Matushka, their little mother. She proceeded to the Kazan Cathedral, where in a hastily arranged but profoundly symbolic ceremony, the Archbishop of Novgorod blessed her and proclaimed her the autocratic empress of all Russia. In a matter of hours, with barely a drop of blood shed, a 33-year-old German princess had seized control of the largest empire on earth. When Peter heard the news, he crumbled. His first instinct was to flee, then to negotiate. He was captured without a fight, a pathetic figure pleading for his violin and his mistress. He signed a document of abdication without protest. Catherine was secure on the throne. But a week later, a dark postscript was added to her triumph. Peter was dead. He had been taken to a country estate at Ropsha under the watch of Alexei Orlov and his men. The official cause was a severe colic, but the truth was murkier. It was likely he was killed in a drunken brawl that escalated, an unplanned act of violence by guards who despised him. Catherine had almost certainly not ordered his death, but the timing was damningly convenient. Her enemies, both at home and abroad, now had the weapon they needed. The coup had shocked the monarchies of Europe, but a woman deposing her husband was an outrage against the natural order. Now they could add a more potent charge: regicide. The whispers that once called her a flirt now branded her a murderer. The narrative was being written in the hostile courts of Paris, Vienna, and London. She was not a brilliant political strategist who saved a nation from a disastrous ruler. She was a ruthless, sexually manipulative usurper who had murdered her way to the throne. The victory was hers, the crown was on her head, but as she stood alone, the absolute ruler of Russia, Catherine knew that the coup had been the easy part. A new war had just begun, a war of whispers and ink, a battle for her very legacy. And it would be a war she would have to fight for the rest of her life and beyond.
With the crown secured and her husband in his grave, Catherine II stood as the absolute autocrat of an empire that sprawled across 1/6 of the Earth's surface. It was a realm of staggering diversity and brutal contradictions, a domain of permafrost and sun-baked steppes, of exquisite poets and illiterate serfs, of enlightened ideals and medieval squalor. To rule it was to ride a tiger, and Catherine knew she could never dismount. For the next 34 years, she would wage a war on two fronts. One was a magnificent public campaign of imperial expansion and cultural rebirth that would dazzle Europe. The other was a shadow war, a relentless private battle against a rising tide of slander designed to drown her legacy in filth. While her enemies sharpened their quills, Catherine picked up a scepter. She embarked on a program of reform and expansion so ambitious it would forever change Russia's place in the world. She saw herself not merely as a conqueror, but as a philosopher on the throne. She entered into a famous correspondence with Voltaire, the titan of the French Enlightenment, flattering him and absorbing his ideas. Their letters were a masterclass in public relations, broadcasting to a skeptical Europe that the usurper in St. Petersburg was a monarch of intellect and reason. She drafted the Nakaz, or Instruction, a monumental legal treatise based on the principles of Montesquieu, advocating for the abolition of torture and capital punishment. Though its radical ideals were too shocking for the Russian nobility to fully enact, it stood as a testament to her vision of a more just and modern state. Her passion for enlightenment was not merely theoretical. She knew that a great empire needed more than a great army. It needed a great soul. With ferocious energy, she became one of history's greatest patrons of the arts and sciences. She established the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, Russia's first state-financed educational institution for women, a revolutionary act in a world that largely saw female education as a frivolous waste. And she began amassing an art collection that would become the heart of the Hermitage Museum. Agents across Europe were tasked with buying entire collections of masterpieces, transforming the Winter Palace into a dazzling universe of Rembrandt, Rubens, and Raphael. It was a bold declaration that Russia was no longer a grim outpost on the edge of civilization, but a true European cultural power, rivaling Paris and Rome. This golden age was financed by military might. Catherine proved to be as cunning in war as she was in philosophy. She achieved the ancient Russian dream of a warm water port, waging 2 successful wars against the Ottoman Empire that culminated in the annexation of the Crimea. Russian ships now sailed the Black Sea, projecting her power into the Mediterranean. In the West, she skillfully manipulated the rivalries of her neighbors to orchestrate the partitions of Poland, absorbing vast new territories and millions of new subjects into her empire. She was ruthless, pragmatic, and brilliant, expanding Russia's borders more than any ruler since Ivan the Terrible. She demonstrated her strength internally as well, crushing Pugachev's rebellion, a massive and bloody peasant uprising with an iron fist, proving to the nobility that she alone could guarantee their security. Yet for every city she founded, for every victory she won, for every masterpiece she hung, a new lie was spawned in the salons of her rivals. The smear campaign that began at her coronation now became a sophisticated international effort to delegitimize her. Unable to fault her competence, her enemies attacked her character. Her court, a serious political work, was painted as a den of debauchery, and the focus of their attack was her love life. The truth was far more practical and far less scandalous. As a de facto widow and an absolute monarch, Catherine could not remarry without ceding her power to a husband. Instead, she took a series of lovers. Over her 34-year reign, she had approximately 12 significant relationships. These were not the fleeting encounters of a nymphomaniac, but often long-term partnerships. Her lovers were not disposable toys. They were her most trusted advisors, generals, and statesmen. Grigory Orlov, the man who helped her put on the throne, remained a key figure for over a decade. He was followed by the most important man in her life, Grigory Potemkin. A brilliant, one-eyed, and larger-than-life statesman, Potemkin was her intellectual and political equal, her co-ruler in all but name, and very likely her secret husband. Their partnership was one of the most formidable in the 18th century. Yet in the funhouse mirror of European propaganda, these powerful alliances were twisted into evidence of an insatiable sexual appetite. The double standard was breathtaking. France's Louis XIV and XV had paraded scores of official mistresses, a practice seen as a perquisite of masculine power. When Catherine did a fraction of the same, it was proof of female depravity. The most infamous myth, that of her death during a sexual act with a horse, was the final, posthumous victory of her detractors. It was a complete fabrication, a piece of gutter-press fantasy that likely emerged in France decades after her death, designed to humiliate her memory in the most grotesque way imaginable. The reality was mundane, human, and poignant. On November 17, 1996, at the age of 67, Empress Catherine the Great suffered a massive stroke in her dressing room and died peacefully in her bed the following day. She had ruled for 34 years, transforming Russia from a regional player into a global empire. The final irony is that the lurid myths intended to erase her accomplishments have paradoxically ensured her fame. But they have obscured the real woman, a leader of formidable intellect and unwavering will. Her campaign against her was a prototype for a brand of misogyny that persists to this day. When a powerful woman cannot be attacked for her competence, she is attacked for her sexuality, her personal life, her very womanhood. Catherine's true transgression was not her sex life, it was her genius. In an age ruled by men, she seized a man's throne, ruled with a man's authority, and outthought, outmaneuvered, and outbuilt most of her male contemporaries. She shocked Europe not with her bedroom conduct, with her raw competence. She proved that a woman could govern an empire, lead armies, and shape history with as much, if not more skill, than any king. That was her real scandal. And it is why the lies were necessary, to reduce the brilliant empress to a sexual caricature, making her power and the power of all women seem unnatural and grotesque. The true story of Catherine the Great is not a cautionary tale of vice. It is an enduring saga of female triumph against a world determined to see her fail.